If we could start out, tell us what was the motivation in writing your book, Loyal to the Sky?
Well, I wrote a series for Salon.com from Miami in November 2003, and I was in Miami with my Affinity group, which is a group of people that comes together to organize around specific actions. We went to Miami to protest the free trade area of the Americas, which was a proposal to extend the North American Free Trade Agreement to the entire Western Hemisphere. We thought this was a very bad idea. These are trade policies that punish the poor and the planet and really just make a farce of democracy and consistently exclude input from the people they would most affect. So we went to Miami to protest, and I wrote a series from the perspective of an activist for Salon.com, a daily series. And they called it Notes from an Activist. And it actually, it drew a great deal of response, both positive, and negative. And what that showed me was how many misconceptions there are out there about the global justice movement, about our motivations, about how we organize, whether we organize at all, really. And just the level of response, again, some very, very positive and some quite negative, showed me that there's a lot out there worth exploring.
And when did you become an activist?
You know, I don't know that there's any one moment. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, as I write in Loyal to the Sky, and so there were moments where, having been raised by parents who were critical of apartheid, which was actually rare among the white population that I came into contact with, there were moments where on the playground or with my peers, I really felt compelled to speak out and to say, no, this is not actually right. It's not right for this country to be ruled by white people and for black people to be excluded altogether from any of the resources, kept out of the cities, etc. And I think definitely my consciousness grew out of that. But I would say that, you know, every one of us is an activist. We all take actions, and we do get to choose whether we want to act in ways that create positive or negative results. And I think the same thing motivated me, that motivates every one of us when we see injustice, really, when we see something that's hurting, be it the planet, be it in our communities, and we feel compelled to speak out. And that comes from a place of compassion. You see injustice, and really you want to help. So, I think what brought me to that point was what brings everybody to the point of wanting to make a difference. And then from there, I think it's just making a series of decisions that sort of takes you further in that direction. I think sometimes the first step is the hardest, because it feels like, how do we make a difference? You know, the issues we face, the institutions we may be working to change sometimes seem very vast and omnipotent. So I think sometimes it's the first step, actually believing it's possible to make a difference.
And so where along the line did you also start pursuing journalism?
I've always written, and writing's always been a very important form of expression for me. And I think, you know, it began, I didn't, while I was an English major in college, I didn't actually go to journalism school or anything like that. And I think I sort of began by just knowing that I really loved to write and seeing if I could try it. And I think I got lucky, actually, with my first few pieces, and then started to see what a powerful medium it was, really, for expression, especially of voices that too often do not go heard. And I love to travel. And after I had done some freelance journalism in San Francisco, which is where I was from, I decided to spend some time in South Asia backpacking. This was right after 9/11 had happened, and I also decided it would be a very good idea to report from the region. As the U.S. was going to war in Afghanistan, there was very little journalism coming from that area, and I was destined for India and Nepal. And so I decided to sort of merge my backpacking trip with some journalism, and ended up freelancing from the region, foreign corresponding for the San Francisco Chronicle. And the war in Afghanistan, while it wasn't reported on a great deal in this country, had major impacts on Indo-Pakistani relations. They actually came quite close to nuclear war at one point. And while they stepped back from the brink, that itself had major impacts on Hindu-Muslim tensions within India, which culminated in 2,000 Muslims getting slaughtered in Gujarat. This was at a time where America was getting very focused on Islamic fundamentalism and things like this, and I felt these were issues that were very important to report on. So that was for me a time when it really expanded from a hobby into more, and I felt, wow, this is really a very powerful tool. There's a lot I can do with this.
And do you see a clear line between when you're a activist and a journalist?
It definitely gets blurred sometimes, and I think sometimes it takes some discipline on my part to remember my roles in different situations. However, it's interesting because I've often written from the perspective of an activist for Salon.com, for the Chronicle, for their Insights section, and then there are times that I haven't. You know, it also gets blurry because sometimes I'm writing for more mainstream publications like newspapers, and other times I'm writing for more progressive publications, for Tikkun magazine, or even Orion magazine, where there's a specific bent towards environmental issues. It gets confusing, you know, especially the past couple of years things have changed, but certainly for the first term of the Bush administration, it felt like this country veered heavily towards the right. And in that situation, you know, what is the middle ground? What is objectivity, really? When, you know, the whole Congress, minus a few courageous exceptions, support going to war in Iraq, where to me, to many people on the left, this seemed like a very bad idea and lacking any substantial evidence. So in the book, in Loyal to the Sky, I explore what it means to try to write, quote unquote, objectively when everything seems to be sliding very far from the objective. And it's quite an interesting issue. You know, it certainly prompted some exploration on my part. I think every journalist, whether they recognize it or not, comes from a certain bias. They choose their quotes. They choose who they interview. And I think it's important to actually recognize that, and then really to just be very, very conscious as one goes about writing. There have been times writing for more mainstream publications when I think my editors have had to rein me in a little bit, but I think it's an interesting question, and there isn't a very clear answer, but I do explore it in the book.
How do you choose the issues that you focus on as an activist?
Sometimes I think they choose me. You know, I went to a socialist summer camp at the age of 16 and became exposed to feminism, and went back and started a women's group in my high school, which was far more controversial than one would imagine it would be in this day and age. You know, and then as a Jew, I spent a year living in Israel during college, and had some ideas that had been very precious to me sort of damaged or devastated, really, in the process. This was after Yitzhak was assassinated, and the situation was sliding rapidly downhill. And I started to become active around Israel and Palestine, around ending the occupation. I would say, again, that was an issue that chose me. As a Jew, as someone who is automatically a citizen of Israel, I felt it was my duty, really, to speak up when Israel was taking steps that I considered wrong and very destructive, not only for the Palestinians, but actually for Israelis as well, for future generations of Jews. So I think often they've chosen me. Sometimes with global justice issues, I think it's been a matter of the people that I've met and developing a consciousness around something like free trade, which is not an obvious issue in the way that war or the conflict in the Middle East is. I think given corporate globalization, the effects of free trade agreements are often hidden from us living in this country because they happen in China or Costa Rica or Bolivia. So I think that sometimes that actually takes effort, really, reading alternative media, meeting people who are already aware and conscious around these issues. And so I think with that issue, it's been a matter of who I've met and getting my own consciousness raised around what it means, and then also traveling to South America, to South Asia, and seeing the effects firsthand for myself.
And how about the organizations that you have worked with and worked for? Was there any particular catalysts that brought you into a working relationship with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I started working at the Tikkun community. My friend found the job ad in a newspaper and called me saying, "This is the perfect job for you." And I had no idea what the perfect job for me could possibly be. And I went in and interviewed and found an organization that thought very much like I did. And all of a sudden was sort of elevated into this position where I was traveling around the country and speaking on this issue. That was often very difficult, as I write in the book, because I came under fire from both Palestinians and from Jews. In fact, I would say more so from other Jews, because more often I was speaking to Jews, which was a very painful experience, to be called an apologist or a traitor by other Jews. With other issues, I think, with, for example, Direct Action to Stop the War, this is a collective that sprang up in San Francisco around the war in Iraq, and was responsible for organizing the shutdown of San Francisco. 20,000 people stepped out into the streets of San Francisco on March 20th, 2003, the day after Bush declared war in Iraq. 20,000 people stepped out into the streets to protest this war, and over 1,500 of them were arrested. It all began at a meeting, I like to tell this story, where 8 people sat around a table, spending at least an hour debating whether we should call it Direct Action to Stop the War or Direct Action to Stop War. And then it only got bigger and better from there. And that really, I think, was, really feeling very strongly like I needed to do something about this war. And having friends where we got together and said, we do want to do something about this war. We need to show how much we care, how wrong we think it is. And it was a moment, I think, in sort of the collective psyche where many, many people felt that way. So it was the right time to organize an action like this. A lot of my activism has been through singing, and during that day, I sang a couple of times in different locations, and there was sort of this feeling like I may not be able to stop the war, but this is what I can give, this is what I can do. And I think that day gave people an opportunity to really do that, and that is vital. We can do something, we can protest, we can show our resistance. And people said, well, we didn't stop the war, we failed. And I think that's a really limited way of looking at it, because we built a movement. And I think that how hard and how low the Bush administration has fallen the past 2 years has a lot to do with the movement that was built the first 4 years of their administration.
Do you have for yourself, do you have a sense for when you opt to work with a group versus kind of like when you do things on your own? Mm. Because some people, it seems like they battle things, issues on their own or in small, let's say, just people they know in the neighborhood. And then there's other times when it appears that joining a large organization has its benefits. Mm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I like talking about smallness and how important smallness is. Small organizations, working with your friends. I think those efforts are very important, actually, working with people who are like-minded. One of the things with the global justice movement that I really appreciate is that it works on the basis of affinity groups, which means that these are actually small groups of 5 to 15 people who know each other, and who for bigger actions come together at spokes council meetings where each affinity group sends a representative to the spokes council, and at the spokes council all decisions are made by consensus process. And what this means is that it really incorporates the ideals of smallness and of diversity into the actual decision-making process. And March 20th, 2003 is a wonderful illustration of that, because there were all kinds of people out on the streets. There were soccer moms and bus drivers and CEOs and grandparents and children and I think the model by which it was organized really allowed for that kind of diversity. So what I would say to answer your question is that I think it's actually really important to work with people who feel the way you do. And I think it's also important to be able to work in larger groups. And that can mean coming together in a coalition. Like, for example, United for Peace and Justice is the biggest national peace coalition. And it coordinates larger marches and actions around the country. For example, March 17th through 19th is a weekend where there's going to be all kinds of actions around the whole country. They're already being planned to commemorate, the 4-year anniversary of the beginning of war in Iraq and to call for bringing the troops home. So I would argue that both are important, actually, that it's important to work with people that you agree, developing the models that you think will work. And ultimately, these small models, they're vital because the answers will have to be small. Ultimately, it's going to have to come down to our communities, to localized answers, because those are ultimately what are going to be sustainable. I think there are some big ticket answers, some answers that deal with big institutions. I do think electoral politics are very important. It's important to vote. It's important to support progressive legislation. But I also think it's important to build the alternatives, which may seem completely radical, but actually in the long term will be the kinds of answers we need. So I think both are important. I think it's important to work in your community. I also think it's important to come together with people who share your values, where you may not have the exact same answers, but you need large numbers when it comes to things like protesting war.
So it sounds like the example of an affinity group is a good model for people who are considering actions.
Absolutely. And, for your listeners out there, it's really easier than it sounds. I think, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to demolish the assumption that activists know what they're doing and have all the answers and everybody else doesn't. Really, we're making them up as we go. The Zapatistas say, caminamos preguntando, which means walking, we ask. And what that means is that as we walk, we ask the questions that will lead us where we need to go. And I think this is a really interesting way to look at how we take action. And I think it speaks to the need both to ask the questions and to examine what we're doing and if it's working as we do it, because we do need to do things. This is the time to be active. And activists don't have the answers. They may have some answers. They certainly have some ideas, and I think have a grip on what has worked and what may not work. But for people out there who have ideas, it may just be that no one's thought of it yet. This may be a completely brilliant model, and I encourage you to get your friends around you, and whether it's organizing a protest, whether it's something like community-supported agriculture, whether it's starting a new collective in your community, go for it, really. It is easier than you may think. I think it's a matter of getting together with like-minded people and making something happen. And we all essentially start from a place of not knowing what will work. And I trace this in the book. I trace my journey towards being active and getting active. And there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of ambivalence, actually, as well. I'm not sure if this is working. Maybe I should just sit at home. Everybody goes through that process, and it's just a matter of starting where you are and working with what you have. And each one of us does have that ability. I get asked, as I think activists in general get asked, well, how do I save the world? What do I do? And the answer I have is that we are all how we save the world. You are how we save the world, and that you know how to save the world, because you know what calls to you, and you know what you're good at and where you can give. And if you don't know, I would say spend some time getting really quiet and listening, because it is there somewhere inside of you. And each of us has a different role to play, but it is there. And then once you have some inkling of how to go about doing what you feel you need to do, be really creative about it and be bold. Now is the time to be bold.
Do you find that you are a member of multiple affinity groups, one for, let's say, each issue, or do you have like a single affinity group?
Well, with affinity, I've worked with one affinity group most of the time, and I think that has been a place to organize specific actions, come together on specific campaigns. My affinity group was called Code Orange. It has since sort of died a sad death, and basically I think that's because a lot of the issues that brought us together, we sort of diverged on what we wanted to work on after the war in Iraq. And while we came together on certain other things, I think, at some point it had sort of served the purpose it needed to serve. And so while it was sad, I think we all of the individuals who were in that group moved on and are continuing to do very positive work in their communities in different ways, whether it's sort of environmental concerns or political concerns, social justice, human rights. I myself moved into a household called the Base House, which stands for Buddhist Alliance for Social Engagement. And for myself, I've been exploring living in a community where we are merging our activism with practice. And what that means is that myself and the other people who live in this house, we all meditate. And for me, that's a really important tool for actually looking inward and for looking at what underlies my activism, what underlies what I believe in. When am I coming from a place that's dominated by anger? When am I coming from a place that's dominated by love? And what forms are working? So kind of really exploring models whereby we go about making social change. I think the reason I've gotten to this place is that as I talk about in Loyal to the Sky, as I explore, a lot of the activism that I had done had felt quite angry at times. It had felt very negative, and it had gotten me to a point of wondering whether the actions we were taking were helping or hurting, whether they were bringing people together or pushing them apart. And that led me to a place of really wanting to explore different models, models where I know that what we're doing is coming from a place of peace. In confronting violence in the world, or in the institutionalized, whereby violence is institutionalized, I think it is crucial to counter that with true peace. And what that means is, walking in the footsteps of people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and today the Dalai Lama, where they are actually being peace and meeting these systems, these institutions, meeting violence with true peace. That, I think, is the only lasting answer, and indeed the only sustainable one as well, when it comes to thinking about how we work and what we want to create in the world around us. So that's what's led me to this point.
Well, speaking of sustainability, and it sounds like you partly answered this, but how do you keep your positive outlook when you're dealing with a lot of issues that are pretty dark and depressing at times?
That's a great question. I traveled to a community named Sarayaku in southern Ecuador to write about it. I wrote a couple of articles about them. It's a community of indigenous people, 1,000 strong, and they have virtually nothing from a Western perspective in terms of materially. Ecuador auctioned off a number of plots of land in the southern Amazon for oil exploitation in 1996, and the land the Sarayaku live on was also auctioned off to the CGC, the Compañía General de Combustibles, and they kept come into the land to exploit for oil, and the Sarayaku kept them out. They actually went to their borders and bodily held them out. And not only that, but they mobilized a global campaign, and they went to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which ruled for them and against the oil company, against the state of Ecuador as well. Essentially, the Sarayaku won. It is examples like this that keep me hopeful, and there are many examples like this around the world. Sometimes they don't well, often they don't fit within the boundaries of the mainstream media, so you don't hear about them. And I think this means looking to the alternative media. There are many examples of hope if we just look around us, really. Also, for me, through my own practice, through meditation, I feel like in looking at the violence that lies within me and doing my best to hold it with at least patience, and if I can muster it with love, what's been interesting is that I've actually seen transformation inside me. And this is what I think Gandhi meant when he said, be the change you want to see in the world. Seeing that transformation inside me, seeing some really old patterns loosen just a little bit, gives me hope. And in this sense, it's almost on a bodily or a visceral level. It's hard. It's not an intellectual thing. But as much as I see examples in the world around me that have given me hope, I've seen within me change. And that change is actually possible. And this has given me hope as well. I think it's crucial to balance these. I think if you just sit in meditation, it can become navel-gazing. And I think it's really important to examine what we're doing and why we're doing it as it is to keep doing it, and to do the work in the world that we need to do, to really balance the two.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Mike.
We've just been talking with Marisa Handler. She is an activist and journalist and author of the new book, Loyal to the Sky, Notes from an Activist.